Hello again, this is Dr. Mike Cochrane with Value Function Analytics, and today we're going to continue our discussion of value-focused thinking, or VFT, by discussing how we might identify and structure objectives in our value model. Recall that the last time we introduced the concept of an objective, particularly a fundamental objective, and discussed how fundamental objectives and their associated decision contexts are related in a decision frame. First, let's review some basics about articulating and specifying objectives. Everyone has objectives. The problem is that we very often don't make them explicit. Some of the time, decision makers think that they understand their objectives well enough that they don't feel a need to write them down formally. Perhaps they don't perceive the need to take the time to do this given the pressures that they are under to produce results. Very likely it is that no one has ever provided them with a systematic and structured approach to thinking about their objectives and articulating them in a way that makes them useful for decision making. The bottom line, if you're involved in a decision or decision making at any level, you are also involved in achieving objectives. So you might as well be explicit about identifying and structuring them. When we speak of specifying objectives, we're talking about taking the fundamental objectives and further breaking them down into more detailed sub-objectives that completely specify the parent fundamental objective. This is not necessarily something that has to be done by the CEO or other key decision makers. They or should come from individuals who are both knowledgeable about the decision and its context and have an interest in or a stake in the outcome of the decision. And there may not be an obvious decision maker. Since the key point of all this is to make better decisions, we should look for stakeholders who are competent to take part in both the articulation and the structuring processes. Top-level organization decision makers will often be helped by having a draft set of structured objectives for them to consider and refine. How do you come up with objectives, or how do you identify objectives? Well, one way to do this, and I'll spend some time on this slide talking about brainstorming methods. The first thing you want to do is generate a rough outline of the decision context and or some general objectives. And here's a list of techniques that you can use to help stimulate the identification of possible objectives. The first thing is you could come up with a wish list. You could come up with a qualitative list of objectives without any priority and ask the questions like, if you had no limitations at all, what would your objectives be? What's the bottom line for the decision situation and the decision maker? Words that can trigger questions that help make decisions or objectives rather explicit. Words like trade-offs or consequences or impacts, things like that. You can review your alternatives, review of existing alternatives to try and articulate the features that distinguish them. This can provide a basis for identifying some objectives for the decision problem. You can look at problems and shortcomings that the organization has. Making a list of those sometimes will make certain objectives obvious. You can look at potential consequences for actions that the organization might take, and that might stimulate some thinking about identifying objectives. Certainly, if there are any existing goals or company or organizational constraints or guidelines, that might be a way to stimulate generating some objectives. And if you're working in a group, everyone is going to have a slightly different perspective on things. So it's helpful just to get everyone's perspective out on the table or on the board and really try to look and see if you can generate some objectives by comparing the different perspectives people have. Take a look at your organization's strategic objectives, if you've got those. There may be some generic ones that you can find from other literature or other sources or other organizations. And then the process of structuring the objectives and quantifying the objectives, as we'll go through and talk about more when we get into more detail on VFT. The very act of doing that is going to help you identify even more objectives. So the point is that this is not an exhaustive list. This just is something or some techniques to help stimulate the identification of possible objectives. Now I'm going to introduce the topic of means objectives as opposed to fundamental objectives. And there is a difference, and this is a simple heuristic that allows you to be able to tell the difference between a means objective and a fundamental objective. If you ask the question, why is objective X important? Then if the answer to that is, well, it's important because achieving that objective is going to lead to Y. Well, then more than likely, X is a means objective and not a fundamental objective. If you ask the same question about Y, and why is it important? Well, if it's important because it influences Z, then Y might also be a means objective rather than a fundamental objective. Until you get to the point where you can say, okay, now Z is important because, well, it's just important. Then you've reached the point where you've got a fundamental objective. So this is one way of being able to distinguish the difference between a means objective and a fundamental objective. And here's a simple fundamental objectives hierarchy. Let's take a look at this for a minute. Note that at each level or tier, the sub-objectives should completely specify the meaning of the higher level objectives. This is only an example, so the notion of maximizing safety would look completely different in another decision context. What is this decision context here? We're talking about automobile safety. So safety aboard a cruise ship would be a completely different context. Some of these sub-objectives might be the same, but you might add additional ones. So the point to take away here is that this is a hierarchical structure where the lower level completely specifies the higher level. Now let's take a look at a means objectives network. And note that the means-ends relationships and the specification relationships are different, and we shouldn't intermingle them. Means-ends relationships need a network structure rather than a hierarchy, since specific means can influence more than one higher level objective. So note, for example, that the directional arrows moving back towards the higher level means objectives means that the lower level ones influence the higher level ones. And you can see that there are multiple arrows going into some of the means objectives from other ones. And this is the network structure. So the bottom line there with the red arrow says that you've got to answer the question, how can we achieve the higher level objective, or how better can we achieve the higher level objective? This is the difference between a means-ends objectives network, and you build your value model primarily based on the fundamental objectives, but it's useful to have a means objectives network because that's going to be able to help you ultimately in being able to achieve the alternatives, or actually the objectives that the alternatives or the selected alternative is going to help you achieve. So let's go back for a second as we finish up here to our decision frame illustration. Fundamental objectives are controlled by and linked to alternatives that are in the same decision context. In other words, if an alternative is outside the decision context, any objectives linked to that alternative would not be fundamental objectives within the decision context. In this case, alternative D could still be in the overall strategic decision context, but you'd have to come up with another fundamental objective and associated decision context for it. Next time we will continue this discussion about structuring fundamental objectives, and we'll talk more in detail about how we actually do that by using an example. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, send me an email at valuefunction@gmail.com, or you can visit my website, valuefunctionanalytics.com, and make a comment there.